entrepreneurship, for the private sector to be ready and active. And I think that needs simultaneously a lot of reform in terms of education and training.
Yes, well, as Fuad mentioned, the economic strategy and the human capital strategy should be aligned. That is obviously very important. I mean, I can't produce or bring doctors and then there are not enough hospitals. They're just going to be unemployed. So these things have to align. Now, the other thing that you mentioned, which is really, I think, important that we look at, is the government being, the major economic agent. It really has distorted over the past, has distorted the education system in a way. So the government pays more money than the private sector,
yes,
has more benefits, etc. So as a student, I go to the university, I calculate my expected utility, and I figure out that, I should maybe major in something not necessarily that I like, but it's hard work, maybe not engineering, not a doctor, but maybe something else. And I can go to the government and make, more money
and
than
this
an
is
engineer.
The culture that they've been talking about,
exactly,
that it needs to be changed,
and that,
correct?
Yes, exactly. And that culture needs to be changed, and I think it can be changed. Now, once you have the private sector being, the vanguard, the lead, then you'll have that signal that it signals to the other to the students and to others who want to enter the labor market, that these are the jobs that actually are available, these are the jobs that actually can give you a return on your education, etc. The other thing, obviously, that we need to ensure is that there is a strong linkage between the education system, obviously, and the private sector, and all the the training that is required, the internships, all these things, yes, that actually promote the private sector and education at the same time.
Just want to announce in 7-10 minutes I will be taking some questions from the audience if they want to prepare some questions. In 10 minutes, just I wanted to announce. Dr. Osama, it is a must now that they go into diversification. Do you think there are a model they will follow, or because we stated from the beginning this region has a specific structure of economy, they have to create their own model for diversification?
In that context, mention the role of the state and the leading hand. I think an important point made by Fuad and Rida in their presentation is that there is the risk-adjusted returns in the export sector is actually quite, it requires state intervention. I mean, if you compare the profitability right now, the non-tradable sector in many of the GCC countries is much higher than in the export sector. And that's why you have to have this push by the state. I would say that, I agree that the important steps need to be taken to reduce that risk. But there's a more fundamental risk facing the small and medium size enterprises, something that Raed and Hatem have alluded to. You have the risk, for example, that is emanating from the lack of credit bureaus, information on the credit worthiness of borrowers, distortions in the land market for these enterprises. And this affects all industries, whether it is non-tradable, tradable, import substitutes in the export sector. And that is a very, very big risk. And I would argue that if the distortions to those, especially to those enterprises, which by the way are in emerging market countries, the main employers, most of the employment in the private sector comes from the SMEs. I think if we actually address those market failures, then you'll have huge productivity gains. And so I would say in terms of the model, yes, I agree with the model that's presented. I would just say that we need to first remove the impediments to the expansion of the SMEs at a more basic level. And for the many of the GCC countries, these basic failures are still there.
Mr. Rida, you learned so many cases, you studied them, Singapore, Korea, Malaysia, and some other. There are some very good examples, and I'm sure you also studied some failed examples. What should be avoided in this case?
Right, so I guess, as we mentioned during the presentation, maybe I couldn't dwell on, but import substitution seems to be a mistake, right? The idea that, well, if you basically decide to go into some sophisticated industry, that you need high tariffs, protect some kind of a monopoly, and then it would succeed, it seems to have failed most of the case, if not all the cases, right? So that's one mistake, to avoid competition, whether domestically and abroad. I guess the other mistake to avoid is to concentrate on specific firms or individuals, right? Instead to be at the sectoral level. You want to promote a whole industry, right? Not some specific firms, and you need to learn how to let go of some firms, right? The experience of Korea shows it. For example, we all know Hyundai and Kia, right? But it's not known that there were up to 17 car companies in Korea, and most of them disappeared, which means that, well, there was support, but they let basically competition domestically and abroad play its role. So I guess these are two mistakes.
Because the models is being written now, adapting, changing, making priorities. The vision is here. Do you think the different GCC countries should coordinate on this, or each country should have its own model? What is the successful thing in your experience?
Well, definitely coordination. I mean, there is no doubt about it. On top of monetary policy and other policy that has been discussed by Dr. Hatim earlier. So, for example, there is a discussion. Everyone wants to create a tourism attraction or financial center or some other service-oriented center. Well, how many, for example, financial centers can we have in the small region as the Gulf? Not many. Even looking at Asia, there are not many financial centers. Looking at the US, it's pretty much New York, maybe San Francisco, to some extent Chicago, and US is a huge country. In Europe, London, Frankfurt, so you have much smaller number of financial centers than, for example, everyone wants to replicate within the region. How many ports or logistics centers you would want to create? Probably, whoever has the first advantage probably wins to some extent, but doesn't mean that others cannot, because it's still a competition to some extent, but it's best to coordinate.
So basically they will say, you take finance, I will take manufacturing, you'll take... is it this way they will share?
I would say more of... for example, I would say if there is... the idea would be if you create a, let's say, enabling environment, and most countries do have that. Well, the private sector would create whatever they want. You don't need to, as a state, to intervene. But if the state has to intervene and has to coordinate amongst the GCC countries, amongst the 6 countries, well, if it's about manufacturing, well, like Airbus, for example, or Boeing. I mean, for example, Airbus, well, say France and Germany, and then a lot of small firms connect to it. And actually, they get a lot of subsidies too.
Working. Yes.
So that would be the idea. Coordination in the manufacturing, it would be important. But as Rida said, you don't want to create goods to sell in the country, you want to export them.
There are any coordination between the Gulf countries now to create the model for diversification of the economy?
The coordination takes place irrespective of these targets, the diversification or what have. Look at the coordination on financial matters that takes place. Look at the creation of the customs union, or today what has become the common external tariff, right? The trade policy, right? The transport hub, the rail system. All this are subjects of continuous and constant coordination, right? And this is mostly the case, the coordination aspect. You call for it when you call for government to be the driver in any one sector and any one activity, right? And everyone understands that, the benefits of close relationships, be they those between countries or between married partners, come at a price. So it's a give and take thing, right? So not everyone wants to have a DIFC.
They are 6 countries. They are diversifying now their economy. They took this decision. There are visions. They are clear. 21 years ago, UAE started. 2030, a few weeks ago, KSA started. Which country will be leading the new model in the GCC country?
The new model. Well, first of all, I'll just go back and say, yes, they definitely should coordinate, because if you look at the current trade within the GCC, it's really minimal compared to the other countries that they trade with. So definitely it's important to coordinate. And let's just take the automobile industry, for example, that I mentioned earlier, that because of the energy availability and the availability of, let's say, aluminum, which is a major component of car manufacturing, Saudi Arabia would be a good place to actually start building cars. And as I mentioned, Isuzu opened a manufacturing facility there. So that would be, for example, something that the GCC could coordinate on. I'm going to produce cars, you produce something else, and the UAE, for example, is the real estate sector. Yes, the tourism industry is very flourishing. So that is important. And so I think these are the things that we should be thinking about going forward. I'm sorry, is there another part of that question?
No, those two, you answered the question. Those two countries will be leading the new model.
Well, look, Saudi Arabia is a giant, obviously an economic powerhouse. It has the highest GDP, but the other countries obviously are quite significant in terms of the GDP output and in terms of the potential as well. So, I mean, the UAE, it's a smaller country, but the GDP is half that of Saudi Arabia, which is really amazing.
Yes.
So, and Qatar is one of the richest countries in the world, per capita. GDP. So, all of these countries, I think they can contribute a lot, not just to themselves, but to the region at large. And I'm actually optimistic and bullish on the GCC. Going forward.
We'll start taking the Q&A, and at the same time, from our economists, we will take their propositions, their views as well for this region. For the lady, please.
My question is to Mr. Sharif and Mr. Hassano. Don't you think that the element of leakage is important for sustainable tradable export? In certain industries, they contribute to the pollution of environment. They use strategic water. They use sometimes desalinated water, or they use subsidized commodities like sugar, wheat, etc. Don't you think this is an important element to be factored in deciding this sector? And the figures you showed about export, do you take this into consideration? Thank you.
Of course, so basically your question is about, once you recognize what technologies are important or industries, should you take into account the environment, sustainability? Of course, that's actually even central, right? You want to put it kind of in a symbiotic environment, right? That's true. But as I said, we never said, I guess you have in mind really heavy industries, chemicals, right?
Even tourism, yeah. When you import, if you
yes.
factor the money coming from tourism
yes.
versus the import needed
yes,
for
yes.
tourism.
Yes. So what you're saying is you have to be very precise in the trade-offs, right? Look at the costs, but look at the benefits, but actually all the costs. I agree with you. But then again, what we mentioned is basically you have to have in mind what kind of industries are exportable and are conducive to productivity gains. Now, among those, if you think that some industry, I don't know, high-tech, biotechnology, for example, trying to find medicine to diabetes, right, in some, biotech cluster in the Gulf, that would make sense, right? It's environmentally, it's friendly with the environment and so on and so forth. But again, we're not in the business of picking which industries, but I agree with you. These things should be taken into account.
Any other question from the audience? Yes, please, to the gentleman.
I think my question is more focused on the innovation part of things. I haven't heard from the panel the focus on R&D, which is the source of innovation. I guess I think the lesson learned from the United States we can derive was, though there was lack of engineers, the HB1 visa was a catalyst for the technology industry. So why don't we take advantage of that and apply this here to drive innovation and therefore export something that is of unique so we can have sustainable growth in the future?
Very important question. Actually, to all of you, if I can add as well, the importance of the renewable energy. It is very costly, plus the R&D, very costly, but how it is a must to go for it. Who wants to take the question?
So if I may add,
yes.
Do you have any data about the R&D that is applied in this area for driving such things?
Dr. Raad?
I don't have. You mean R&D expenditure per capita or?
No. I mean, for example, you alluded to the industry, to support an industry. Let's take the technology industry, for example. What sort of R&D do we have for that segment?
The R&D in the Arab world is the lowest in the whole world. That is a fact.
Right. So this is my point. This is the root of the whole thing. Because everything we talked about is like, you know, make it friendly to do business and what have you, those, and tax and all this. These are you know, subset to the core issue that we need to focus on, which is the R&D, which is a source of innovation. Like here we have a technology industry, but it's in training and some services around it.
Yes.
What if we were to have semiconductor industry, for example, when we have engineers? I mean, Dubai is a great city now. It attracts all engineers from all over the world.
Yes.
India and China, we are, you know, down streets from us, supposed to, relative to the United States. Why don't they come here and create some sort of HB1 environment to create innovation, drive technology industry, and so forth?
We'll take the answer from Dr. Hatem.
Okay, let me just say something about R&D. Obviously, as you mentioned, R&D is really among the lowest. In the region, you know, compared to the rest of the world. But that is because of the current system, as we mentioned, where the private sector is really not leading. When you have a competitive private sector, right, one of the things that they want to do is obviously beat the rest of the, you know, the team. So what they do is they invest in technology, they invest in things like that to increase their productivity, which is, you know, one of the topics that important topics that we're talking about today. I should mention also that companies like SABIC, like Aramco, they also have, you can actually have R&D overseas. So if you don't have the current human capital right now, which we don't, not enough, at least not a critical mass that allows us for, you know, high R&D activities, you can actually have that overseas and substitute for that. And that can also provide you with the competition advantage that you need.
If there's someone who has a question, because I have a question also for Mr. Osama. The renewable energy are very important for any economy. For a region that has been rich for the last 5, 6, 7 decades, why they would go to diversify their economy and bring the energy, renewable energy? And it is very costly. How important it is?
I think very important point made in the work that was presented in the book by many researchers and reiterated by Fuad and Rida is that comparative advantage is not necessarily the only criterion. Now, the renewable energy would be important for vertical diversification, and that's a very important point. And so there's a lot to be done in there. In terms of the horizontal, there is activities that are not obviously related to energy. There is a lot of progress to be made by having proper R&D investment, and we have seen how important it is, by actually enhancement of education reform. And here I would say that comparative advantage itself evolves in line with R&D investment and with education. And so even though I agree that activities related to energy, such as renewable energy, such as different uses of the energy that we have, is important. We need to go beyond that, as we have seen.
Yes. For the lady, yes, please. Can we give the mic to the lady? There is someone else. Yes, please. You have the mic.
Faris Bakr from Abu Dhabi Council for Economic Development. My question is to Mr. Fuad. You mentioned something about government intervention in the manufacturing sector. I would like to mention the example of Abu Dhabi. For example, in Abu Dhabi they have invested in Emal, Emirates Steel, and such metals. Let's say the capital-intensive investments, and they were waiting more or less for the private sector to contribute as SMEs. But that didn't happen. So if we take it to, and they provided Khalifa Fund, for example, like a funding arm, they were funding recently up to 15 million manufacturing. But if we, but that still didn't happen. So if we take it down to the culture shift that you mentioned. If you could elaborate more about the experience of Korea, and if we could tailor it to the UAE, because we have a lot of initiatives that has been done. For example, for this year, there has been the reading initiative, the year of reading.
Yes.
And last year we had the innovation year. So if you could elaborate. Please.
Yes, Mr. Rida. Mr. Fuad, sorry.
Right. Important question. Of course, the issue is, can you, if you start a business, if you start an industry and you have huge intervention, I mean, heavy industry is also a bit tricky, who would go into it, how long you have to sustain it before you get the private sector investor and so on. Do you get enough spillovers to the rest of the economy? So if you look at Korea, I mean, they started iron steel industry in the 60s, 70s. They didn't have any iron ore or anything. They actually had to import it all the way from Australia because of the Cold War. They couldn't import it from China. So, but they created huge industry, but their goal wasn't just to produce steel and sell it. They wanted to go beyond shipbuilding, cars, and so on. So they needed that technology, maybe know-how, the input, and then go further. So it was part of the longer strategy in a way. So that really helps. And we discuss if the state has to intervene, do you want to go into, we've seen enough examples about petrochems in Saudi Arabia, actually all the GCC countries with aluminum, petrochems, and other types of steel and so on. Is it really at this stage, should the state continue doing this? And we argue that maybe it should go into more other complicated, complex, sophisticated goods. And that's really probably the argument.
One last question from the lady there, and we will conclude this panel. Please go ahead.
Thank you. Do you think the economic diversification is a means to sustainable and inclusive development, or it is its end itself? So if it's means to a better shared prosperity, then what do you think about the standard? Like, how diversified is diversified enough? Or what are the risks of over-diversified or a yield-diversified development strategy? Thank you.
Yes. How diversified should we go?
It certainly is not an end in itself. It's a means. It's a means for sustainable, yes, development and all that. Now, it is not a holy grail. If you look at some of the most advanced economies, and their specialization in high tech, you'd think that they're not diversified, right? But the key aspect in here is what lies behind diversification. As I stated before, it's not just about number of products and services, but how sophisticated those products, the quality of those products. It's a whole slew of things. And then, you say, all right, let's talk about the share of non-oil in total GDP. A measure of diversification. That's really a very crude measure, because also it oscillates with the price of oil and what have you. So does that mean, in a year like 2014, when the prices went up, that there was a regress in diversification? Certainly not. So all these things matter, but they have to come in line with a structural transformation. That's what we are all seeking, a structural transformation toward, in the context of the UAE, towards a innovative, knowledge-based economy. That's the bottom line.
You have a follow-up, Dr. Hatem?
Just a quick follow-up. I actually think of diversification and innovation as towards the same, really similar. So if you don't innovate, if you don't continue to innovate, you're not going to grow. And as Sheikh Mohammed bin Rashid said in his book والتي,
yes.
العزل دربين بادع وتابع ولا حول الاثنين صار رفيع.
You have to translate this. It's very
Take
important.
the initiative and follow up.
Yes. As you know, after the last question, there are always another question. So the gentleman, he has a question, please. No, it's the one in the front, and I will give you the question, please.
Okay, thank you very much. My question is regarding the debate, the choice between export promotion and import substitution strategy for the development. I think generally that I heard from the discussion that you might be advocating the government role in terms of really reallocating resources toward the sectors that you feel that it is mostly tradable and export-oriented sectors. I think the voice today, with the current situation that the GCC economies are facing, is that they are undergoing through the process of reform and restructuring. And as a result of that, I think the voice is really to reduce the role of the government in overall economy because of the burden that had been the government facing with the drop of the oil price, and that's really pressuring the government revenues. So I think how that would really fits within the overall strategy of export promotion, while we are having other forces in play that is actually telling us that you allow the market economy to really decide what sectors to be promoted and where the resources are going to be allocated rather than having the government intervention. And not to mention that even some of the successful sectors that we have today in the UAE, which is the aviation sector, whenever they hear the government role in any, although I mean it's not been subsidized, and that people would really eventually associate the government intervention with subsidy, and then you have the voices in overseas that you are really subsidizing a sector that you shouldn't, and then all the wars and fights and will go against you in terms of if you really want to promote international markets. Thank you.
Do you take this question, Mr. Rida?
Yeah, I guess most countries or most states, even advanced states, are to some extent developmental states, right? Even though the strategies change, right? If you look at the Southeast Asians, they may look different, but there is always at some level a promotion and support for innovation, right? And research. It's not always through, it's not necessarily through direct subsidies, right? For example, in the book we mentioned the experience of Korea, where the chaebols, the big Korean groups, received most of the support through actually negative real interest rates, right? So would borrow at pretty cheap rates. So I'm not saying that's what should be done. What I'm saying is the tools could be different, and actually the support could come under different shapes, right? It could be done through providing the inputs, which is the skilled labor, and so on and so forth. So the tools comes in shades and colors. Now on your question on, yes, you want, or your work seems to suggest that you need to encourage some industries, while at the same time you want to decrease the role of the government. I think it could be consistent in the sense that it could be thought of a redeployment of the government, right? In the sense that, well, as Fuad mentioned, some sectors maybe do not need government support, right? And if it doesn't need government support, that means let's wait for the government, right? Let the market forces play for some sectors that are less conducive to productivity gains. And then you can support the others. Now, talking about that, we did some independent research, which is actually not in the book, about the origins of electronics in some Asian countries. And what we discovered is that the initial investment was actually extremely small. One of the biggest companies producing, semiconductors in the world, right, started with seed money of a couple of hundred of millions of dollars, right? So it's not necessarily huge investments. It could be pretty small, but if it's in the right sector, with the right environment, it could have huge returns in the future.
Because I opened the other, we still have 2 questions. Yes, please. Can you make it short, please?
Just want the panel to address issues of creating transparency in business processes within the region, especially in the UAE. And also, should the government take a role in reducing monopolies?
Yes.
Now, I don't think we addressed these issues.
Transparency and reducing. I will take the other question also, and we will answer them together.
Thank you.
Yes, please.
I would like to know your opinion on the role of the global demand. I mean, if the global growth remains very weak, do we have any incentive to diversify our economy?
Okay, great. We'll start with the first one. The question is about transparency and Monopoly, reducing the monopoly. I want to address to you, Dr. Raed, the question.
Right. The transparency, I mean, it is a straightforward thing. In the government of Dubai, you know it. There are the strategic plans. Plans are announced that such plans are being, developed. Consultation with business communities, with everyone, stakeholders, shareholders, you name it, take place as the plan is developed, as the plan then becomes a plan, and as it's announced, and then now, in the new era, in the private-public partnership law, there are invitations for the private sector to participate in those plans, in the implementation of the plans as partners rather than subcontractors. Now, in the case of monopoly, within the context of the UAE, there are areas where, yes, there are monopolistic practices here and there, but they are for a stage of development what is needed for the time being. Progress is taking place, and then, if you look at the new commercial laws, new avenues are being opened up. So eventually, through time, you will see a better competitive environment, if you will.
About transparency, Dr. Osama talked about it in the during this session. You want to talk about monopoly?
Yes.